I'm Zonofear and I like to review older PC tech and see what that tech can still do today. I've got an extra special review for you today, and this one is extra special as I am reviewing something that I actually used way back in the day. I am talking about the Phenom X4 955, an AMD quad-core processor released in 2009. But first I'd like to start with a little bit of background. Picture this: Intel have had runaway success with both their Core 2 range of processors and the newly released i-series, and AMD are in a little bit of a pickle. Clock for clock, they simply cannot compete with Intel's new offerings. So what can they do? In steps the Phenom. The first generation Phenoms were released with a lukewarm reception. Using a 65nm monolithic design, they were power hungry, had low clock speeds, and initially featured the infamous TLB bug. The TLB bug was, of course, later patched in a chip revision, but early adopters were hit for an up to 20% performance penalty on a processor that wasn't setting speed records to begin with. The one thing in the Phenom's favour is that on release, these things were cheap, not just as a processor, but as an entire platform. You could pick up a Phenom X4, an AM2 Plus motherboard and some cheap DDR2 memory and save literally hundreds of pounds over an Intel build. Sure, the performance wasn't like for like, but it was competitive enough through that pricing that it swayed enough people AMD's way. The Phenoms ultimately found some mild success, but by this point Intel were pulling leaps and bounds ahead of AMD. How times have changed, eh? Step in the Phenom 2. Releasing on a smaller 45nm process, the Phenom 2 was a significant revision, initially releasing on the AM2 Plus socket with DDR2 support. Today I will be reviewing the Phenom X4 955, released on the AM3 socket and featuring support for up to DDR3 1333. Thanks to the newer 45nm process, the Phenom 2 clocked higher, had better thermals and some minor architecture improvements. But unlike the Phenom 1, the Phenom 2 landed solid hits. Stable, cheap and good performers, gamers loved the Phenom 2. Intel were still the king, of course, but AMD offered something that Intel couldn't or wouldn't: cheap quad-core computing on a budget with the performance to power your games. And this is what we are reviewing today. Initially released around April 2009 for about £200, the Phenom X4 955 Black Edition, featuring 4 cores, 4 threads with a generous at the time 6MB of L3 cache, the 955 is clocked at 3.2 GHz, but unlike later Thuban cores, the NEP didn't have the turbo core feature, which means that 3.2 GHz was the fastest the processor would go without manual overclocking. Speaking of overclocking, the 955 tested today is the Black Edition, which means that it has an unlocked multiplier so you can get more performance out of the chip with the right hardware. However, unlike the Athlon 860K, I will be running this 955 at stock speed today, which was my original experience with the Phenom X4 back in 2010. Overclocking, however, is very easy on these chips though, and the Phenoms could be bumped up to 3.6 GHz straight off with very little tweaking and a cheap £15 aftermarket air cooler. This review is a little bit of a nostalgia trip for me, and I get to see if my memory accurately recalls the Phenom's performance. I used some variation of a Phenom 2 for years, and I was absolutely satisfied with the performance I got for my money. Speaking of money, I picked up this Phenom X4 955 for just £8 from Computer Exchange, a second-hand UK retailer. eBay prices are also fairly similar, so you shouldn't pay too much for one of these in 2024. I'm quick to point out when things aren't right, so I should be quick to say something when they do get things right as well. Delivery from CEX was fast, the Phenom was clean and well packaged, and unlike the 860K, it didn't have any bent pins, so I have to give credit where it's due as well. Anyway, without further ado, let's get to it. System specs are on screen now, and I've paired this Phenom up with 16GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR3 memory, the same Corsair Vengeance memory used with the 860K, running in dual channel with a GeForce GTX 1050 Ti, and I'm running Windows from an SSD to give the Phenom the best chance to show what it can do. Let's get on with the games. First up as always is Grand Theft Auto 5, at 1080p on normal settings with sliders set to around a third. The Phenom delivered a solid playable frame rate that hovered in the 30 to 45 FPS range. The processor was maxed out the entire time I played this, but this didn't really cause any issues with stuttering. The game ran consistently with no issue at all. In fact, after playing and reviewing the footage from my recent Athlon 860K video, GTA 5 played better on the Phenom X4, reaching consistently higher frame rates and a smoother gameplay experience. The Athlon 860K released 5 years after the X4 955, so this result is frankly incredible, and no doubt the Phenom was aided by its 6MB of L3 cache, something the Athlon 860K misses out on entirely. 6MB in this day and age isn't a lot of L3 cache, but this is going to keep on making a difference right the way through our testing today. This is a strong showing by the Phenom, straight from the start line. The post-apocalyptic wasteland of Fallout 4 is up now. At 1080p and using the medium preset, the Phenom once again delivered a decent experience. Traversing the more open areas would see the frame rate hover close to or at the 60 FPS mark, although busy areas such as the infamous Corvega plant would see the frame rate drop into the 30s. Once again though, this felt like a more consistent experience over the 860K. There was the occasional stutter here and there, but overall Fallout 4 was more than playable, and I would say that it was more playable on the Phenom than it was the 860K. Metro Last Light Redux ran great at 1080p high settings. The Phenom and GeForce GTX 1050 Ti pushed well past the 60 FPS mark and kept to it at all times. This was the first game tested today where the Athlon X4 860K took a slight lead over the Phenom, but the result here is so close that it speaks volumes on the strength of the Phenom architecture. I played Last Light Redux for around an hour and had a pretty great time. It really was a very solid experience on hardware that's 15 years old at this point. The Phenom delivered a fair experience on Dying Light. Technically below minimum CPU requirements, the 955 achieved a frame rate around the 45 FPS mark at 900p and using the medium preset. There was the occasional stutter here and there, but overall this was more than playable, and I'd consider maybe capping frame rates to 30 here if you want to have a more consistent experience. The 1050 Ti here actually had plenty more to give, but it was the Phenom that was maxed out on Dying Light. Portal 2 at 1080p and all settings set to max ran great, easily reaching a frame rate measured in the 200s and performing better once again than the Athlon 860K. This was a flawless experience and an era appropriate game for the Phenom, and I had a great time. At 1080p and medium settings, Payday 2 ran amazing, heisting at over 100 FPS despite the age of the Phenom. Payday was an excellent experience on this 15-year-old processor. The gameplay was smooth, consistent, and at quality settings that made this frankly an absolute joy to play. This was excellent. PC Building Simulator makes its first video appearance. At 1080p low, the Phenom achieved a pretty good result, and PCBS was more than playable on this hardware, and an absolute night and day difference versus the 860K. Although I didn't include PCBS in my 860K videos, it performed so poorly that I didn't include it in my initial 860K testing, electing to instead show you how things can be played on it. The Phenom handily achieved a much better result with a frame rate that stayed close to 60 FPS for most of my playtime with it, which is a far cry from what the Athlon achieved and is an excellent result. Dead Island was a solid experience. I'm reminiscent of my first time playing through this game on the X4 955 back in the day. At 1080p and high settings, the Phenom reached and exceeded my own personal 60 FPS preference with an uncapped frame rate. While the performance was great, the frame rate was quite variable, going from, for example, 70 to 100 FPS, and then back down again to 70 FPS within a few seconds. It was great, but I'd personally probably cap the frame rate here at 60 FPS for a more consistent experience, especially in a melee focused game such as this where the timings matter. The Division's bench run ran great. At 1080p low settings, the Phenom achieved a solid result with the frame rate spending most of its time in the 70s, meaning this should be more than playable enough for anyone with similar hardware. As I've said before, I don't really use benchmark runs, but they are a great comparative tool to use in this kind of testing, as the runs themselves are always the same, and it's just the results that differ depending on hardware. You should have a pretty great experience in the Division. Next up is Red Dead 2 now, except it isn't. The Phenom lacks SSE 4.1 and SSE 4.2 support, which means that the game crashes not long after launch regardless of the game's settings. Looking around, people have said here that they've got over this hurdle, but I want to cover stuff that's available to everyone, so I pursued this no further, but I wanted to still bring this up as the first failure of the Phenom of the day. Sniper Elite 4 ran great at 900p medium settings. The game ran between 70 to 100 FPS, and I'd suggest bumping up the settings or resolution for a high quality visual experience. It played well, and there were no problems throughout my half hour or so of playtime in the Mediterranean. And finally, The Witcher 3 in DX11 mode. At 900p and with the medium preset, the Phenom struggled to keep a solid frame rate here, unlike the Athlon 860K. Although the numbers the Phenom posted were respectable for a CPU of its age, I personally felt that they were sadly unplayable due to the stuttering issues that dogged my playtime. If this was the only way you could play, you might find it okay, but this personally wasn't good enough for me, and I would consider this a failure to run, essentially at these kind of settings and at this kind of frame rate. And that's a wrap. The Phenom in 2024 is a mixed bag. On one hand, the games from around the era of the Phenom play great, and this is the reason why these things were so popular, and rightfully so. On the other hand, its lack of certain instruction sets stops it playing anything really modern, even if the processor itself could probably do it with those instruction sets. Comparing the Phenom X4 955 to the Athlon 860K in our last review, the Phenom performs very favourably. A combination of its solid architecture and a generous amount of L3 cache on die that certainly makes a massive difference. This in return makes AMD's design decisions around the Phenom sequel even more bizarre, as when it comes down to it, the Phenom outpaced the Athlon 860K on a number of our games tested today, and it's not because the testing hardware has significantly changed, because it didn't. I use the same DDR3 memory and the same GPU as my 860K testing, and the results speak volumes. I loved this processor when it was released, and even 15 years later, I still love it. It's not something I would go out today and buy, but it was an amazing trip down nostalgia lane that has cemented my fondness for this generation of PC gaming and the great processors that came with it. This is my final video for the year, but I wanted to take a couple more moments to give you an idea of what I have planned next year. My first review for 2025 will be the budget-orientated GeForce GTX 550 Ti, one that a couple of you will have heard me mention in my Radeon HD 5770 review, the GeForce GTX 550 Ti. A tenner? Following on will be more processor reviews, but all of these will be tested on more powerful hardware than I have previously used to put the processors through their paces. The star of this will be the venerable GeForce GTX 1080 Ti, a card that certainly needs no introduction. I'll also be reviewing a first for me, the Intel Core 2 Quad Q6600, another processor with legendary status, and the first time I will have worked with Socket 775 in a technical capacity. You'll also want to stay tuned for another FM2 socket review, but for now I'm going to leave you guessing which one that is. And finally, stick around for an in-depth review of the last Athlon. And with all that said, this is me signing out for 2024, but from my family to yours, I hope you have a great Christmas and wish you a happy, healthy and prosperous 2025. I've been Xenofear, and thank you for watching Houndlander Gaming.